Last winter, I was living by myself in a small house tucked into a quiet neighborhood. Past my backyard, there was nothing but trees and undeveloped land stretching out into the dark. I'd been there for about a year at that point, and nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened. That was part of why I liked the place. It was peaceful. Even though the house was old, it had this warm, comfortable feel to it. This took place over a long weekend when snow kept coming and going, and the temperature barely climbed above zero. It was so cold that I stayed indoors all day. That night was completely normal. I had dinner, cleaned up around the house, watched some TV, and eventually shut everything off. Around 11 p.m., I went to bed. There's one detail about my bedroom that matters here. For about 3 months before this happened, the lock on my bedroom door had been broken. It was one of those push-button locks, and one night I realized it simply didn't work anymore. The door would still click, but it could be opened easily from either side. I never bothered fixing it. I lived alone, no roommates, no family, so it didn't seem important. As long as the front and back doors were locked, the bedroom door felt irrelevant. Buying a new lock and installing it just felt like an unnecessary chore. Sometime later that night, I jolted awake. My heart was racing, though I didn't know why. The house was completely silent and pitch black, but as my eyes adjusted, I noticed something immediately. My bedroom door was slightly open. Every instinct in my body went on high alert. Still, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I hadn't closed it all the way. Maybe the extreme cold or shifting air caused it to drift open. I climbed out of bed quietly, not wanting to turn on any lights, and walked over to the door. I closed it and made sure it was properly latched before getting back into bed. But even after that, I couldn't relax. Something didn't feel right. I kept opening my eyes and scanning the room, even though all I could see were dark shapes and shadows pressed into every corner. I lay there like that for what felt like forever, probably around 30 minutes, forcing myself to calm down, hoping sleep would come. Then I heard it. A faint movement, like a soft shuffle across floorboards. It sounded like it came from either the hallway outside my room or somewhere downstairs. I slowly sat up and listened, holding my breath. Nothing else happened. I stayed completely still for a long time, afraid that if I moved, I'd miss whatever it was or lose my chance to figure it out. Eventually, with no other sound breaking the silence, I carefully lay back down. I kept listening. Minutes stretched on, and at some point, without realizing it, I fell asleep. I only noticed when I woke up again just as suddenly as before, my heart pounding in my chest. And when my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw the exact same thing. My bedroom door was open again, just slightly. I lay there, locked in place, staring at the narrow gap and the heavy darkness on the other side. The hallway light was off, so whatever was out there blended into a deeper, thicker black. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was the house settling. Maybe the latch hadn't caught the way I thought it had. But this time, that excuse didn't work. I clearly remembered how carefully I'd shut the door earlier. I started to sit up, swinging my legs out from under the blankets, getting ready to close it again. That's when I saw it. Something shifted behind the doorframe. It was subtle, like a shape pulling back into the darkness, as if someone had been standing there and moved the moment I did. I went completely still. There were no footsteps, no sound of someone walking away. Nothing but the wind and the quiet creaks of the house responding to the cold. I had no idea if whoever was out there was still standing inches from my door, watching me or waiting. I didn't know what they planned to do next. I stayed frozen for what had to be 5 full minutes, though it felt endless. Then, all at once, I sprinted to the door and slammed it shut, throwing my entire weight against it to keep it closed. No one pushed back. About 15 seconds passed in total silence. Then I heard its slow, muted footsteps moving down the hallway, then descending the stairs. It sounded like they were heading toward the back of the house. After that, everything went quiet again. I called the police immediately. Thankfully, nothing else happened while I waited the 10 or so minutes it took for them to arrive. They searched the entire house, took a detailed report, and asked everything I could remember, though there really wasn't much to go on. They didn't find anyone. While we were standing in the kitchen talking, I glanced toward the back door and mentioned that I'd last heard the footsteps going that way. That's when I saw him again, a dark silhouette standing among the trees behind my backyard. He disappeared almost instantly, moving away before the officers could even turn around. The thought that he might have been out there the entire time, watching us through the windows, was terrifying. I didn't go back to my house that night. I stayed with a friend and then kept staying away for the next few days. In the weeks that followed, the police never really had any updates. But once the snow started melting, I found something that unsettled me even more. Behind my house, in the forest, there were faint but warm paths like someone had walked the same route again and again. One of those trails led directly to the back of my home. Whoever this was hadn't just appeared that night. He'd been watching me for a long time, long enough to wear a path through the woods. The worst realization came when I discovered how he likely got inside. One of the back windows didn't lock properly, just like my bedroom door. Maybe it was coincidence, but considering how long he'd been stalking me, there's a real chance that night wasn't the first time he'd been in my house. And the broken lock on my bedroom door might not have been random at all. I moved out not long after and far away. I just hope I wasn't followed. Even though it's the middle of winter as I'm writing this, what I'm about to talk about actually happened a few months back on Halloween night. I went back and forth for a while on whether I should even share this, but eventually I figured it was worth telling. If nothing else, maybe it'll stop someone else from making the same mistake I did. At the time, I was living in a very old apartment building on the edge of town. It wasn't exactly dangerous, but it definitely wasn't a nice area either. Most people who couldn't afford to live closer to the city ended up there. The whole place dated back to the early 1900s, which made rent cheap, but also meant everything was worn down. My unit had been updated a couple of times, but overall, the building was still in rough shape. Over the last few years, almost everyone else had moved out, leaving the other apartments completely empty. As far as I could tell, whoever owned the building never bothered renting them out again. After a while, it genuinely felt like I was the only person left living there. Every time I walked through the hallways or stairwells, it was completely silent. I never heard voices, footsteps, doors, nothing. About a month before this happened, I remember throwing some clothes into the dryer and then heading out for work. As I walked down all 3 flights of stairs, I could hear the dryer rumbling through the walls, echoing through the empty hallways. That's how quiet the place was. On Halloween night, I had work, and honestly, there wasn't much reason to celebrate anyway. I was older, living alone in an apartment, and kids don't exactly go trick-or-treating in places like that, especially not in a building where no one else lived. When I got home, I dropped my stuff on the floor and sat on the couch, planning to either put on a horror movie or watch something Halloween-related on YouTube. Around 9 p.m., 3 sudden knocks slammed against my front door. It scared me so badly I froze in place. They were loud, deliberate knocks, and then complete silence. Whoever it was, they were standing right outside my door. Still shaking, I stood up and walked over, trying to process the fact that this was the first sign of another human being in the building in months. I cracked the door open, and what I saw only confused me more. It was a child. She was wearing a Halloween costume and holding a bag up in front of her. I stood there staring at her for several seconds, completely stunned, trying to understand what I was seeing. She didn't say a word, just stood there silently. looking at me through her mask. Her bag was completely empty. I felt a brief twinge of guilt for not having any candy. But what really stuck with me was the bigger question. Where did she even come from? I asked how she got into the building and whether her parents lived there. She didn't respond. She didn't even seem bothered by the questions. There was no emotion in her voice or body language, just nothing. I leaned my head out into the hallway and looked past her. There was no one else. No other kids. No other kids. The building was dead silent. I was about to say something else when she suddenly turned around and walked away, heading down the hall toward the stairwell. She didn't knock on any other doors. She didn't stop anywhere. She just left. I stood there listening as her footsteps faded down the stairs and out of the building. After a moment, I closed and locked my door, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. For months, I hadn't seen or heard a single person in that building. No signs of life at all. And then, out of nowhere, on Halloween night, a child shows up at my door. It didn't make sense. I spent a few minutes looking out the windows toward the parking lot, hoping to spot anyone. But just like always, my car was the only one there. No people, no movement, nothing. The parking lot was empty, and the night felt lifeless. After standing there thinking it over for a few minutes, I grabbed my jacket and decided to go see for myself. I stepped out into the hallway, paused to listen, then made my way down toward the stairs. As I went down floor by floor, everything felt exactly the same as always: silent, abandoned, no signs of anyone living there. When I reached the ground level, I looked out through the front entrance. The girl was gone, and there wasn't a single person anywhere near the building. I knew it was Halloween, but that didn't make this any less unsettling. As I pulled the front door closed, something caught my attention. The keypad mounted next to the door was flashing. This wasn't a modern system, just an old, outdated keypad with a buzzer that supposedly used to work years ago. Since I'd lived there, it had never functioned. I always used my physical key, and pressing the buttons never did anything. No lights, no sounds. I'd always assumed it was completely dead. So seeing it suddenly lit up and blinking immediately set off alarms in my head. I shut the door and tested the lock, thinking maybe it wasn't securing properly, but it locked the same way it always had. Still uneasy, I turned and headed back upstairs. I didn't feel safe being out in the open anymore, not after everything that had already happened. I passed the first floor, then the second, and that's when I stopped cold. Something in my peripheral vision didn't look right. I backed up and looked down the hallway. One of the apartment doors was open. That door hadn't been open before. It had to have happened in the few minutes I'd been downstairs. I called out, my voice echoing down the empty hall. Nothing answered. A wave of cold fear ran through me. I rushed up the rest of the stairs, went into my apartment, and shut the door behind me. My body felt like it flipped straight into panic mode. I took a deep breath and started toward the living room. Then the knocking exploded against my door. Loud, aggressive. I hadn't even been inside for 10 seconds. I called out, "Hello," again, staring at the door, but there was no response. The knocking came again, harder this time. Slowly, I stepped closer and looked through the peephole. There was a man standing there. He was dressed entirely in black with a hood pulled low over his face. He slammed his hand against the door again, then leaned his weight into it like he was ready to burst inside the moment I touched the handle. I backed away, my heart pounding. That's when I heard more movement. Footsteps in the hallway. More than one person. They began whispering to each other, but the walls were too thin and the voices too low for me to make out any words. All I knew was that whatever this was, it wasn't over. I grabbed my phone and called 911, then tried to figure out where I could hide. The apartment was tiny, just a one-bedroom, so I didn't have many options. I decided on the balcony, which had blinds covering it. Less than a minute later, I heard a dull thud inside the building. Then light slowly spilled into my apartment as the door creaked open. I watched through the narrow gaps in the blinds as two men stepped inside and started searching the place. My heart felt like it was going to tear out of my chest. They stayed for a while, even coming close to the balcony doors, before eventually leaving. I stayed out there in the freezing cold for about 10 minutes until the police finally arrived. When they searched the building, they confirmed that no one else was supposed to be living there. Legally, I was the only tenant left. No one else should have had access to the building besides the owner. Still, I never got real answers about what had been happening. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like the little girl had been used as bait something to make me feel safe enough to open my door without hesitation when someone knocked later. I moved out within days. After that, everything went quiet. The police stopped calling, and the whole situation slowly faded away. I still don't know what those men wanted, or what was really going on in that building. And I'm grateful I didn't find out that night. Back when this happened, I was working overnight at a small shipping warehouse just outside the city. It wasn't a huge facility, just a long concrete structure with 3 loading bays, a small office, and row after row of tall metal shelves. Most shifts, there were at least 1 or 2 other guys working with me. But during the slow season, the company cut hours, and for a few weeks straight, I was the only person there from midnight until 6 in the morning. At first, it didn't really bother me. The work was simple, and honestly, the quiet felt kind of peaceful. To pass the time, I usually kept my earbuds in and focused on my tasks. All the heavy machinery that ran during the day was completely shut down at night, which made the building feel unnaturally silent. Even small sounds carried. And on this particular night, it was quieter than usual. There were no cars on the nearby highway, no wind hitting the walls. From inside, I could even hear crickets chirping from the trees beside the building because nothing else was loud enough to cover it up. Early into my shift, I put my earbuds in and worked nonstop for a while. I was all the way in the back corner of the warehouse, scanning a pallet, when something made me freeze. Footsteps. They were light, not rushed or heavy, but unmistakably the sound of someone walking. They seemed to be coming from the front of the building, near the office. My first thought was that my boss had shown up without warning, which he'd done before and scared the hell out of me. I pulled my earbuds out and listened. Nothing. After standing there for a minute, I told myself I'd imagined it. But as soon as I turned back to my work, I heard it again. A few slow steps, spaced out, like whoever it was didn't quite know where they were going. "John?" I called out, using my boss's name. No answer. The footsteps stopped too. Trying not to freak myself out, I walked toward the front of the warehouse. The lighting didn't reach the office area very well, leaving that section dim and filled with shadows. I turned on the office light and checked inside, then walked into the break room. No one. With no other explanation, I forced myself to brush it off and go back to work. Normally, things like that wouldn't get to me, which made it worse. Either I was just on edge that night, or something really wasn't right. About an hour later, I finished scanning everything and headed back toward the office to log the data and double-check a few things. The office sat tucked into a corner of the building. I sat down and started doing the usual boring computer stuff, clicking through screens, entering numbers, adjusting totals. I'd been there maybe 5 minutes when, for no real reason, I glanced up at the hallway window that overlooked the warehouse floor. Someone was moving between the shelves. It was just a dark outline, barely visible, but the motion was unmistakable. Someone was walking. I jumped up so fast my chair tipped over and yelled out, trying to get their attention. My voice echoed through the entire warehouse. but the figure disappeared behind the shelving, and I didn't see anything else. I grabbed the closest thing I could use as a weapon, some old metal tool sitting on the desk, and stepped out of the office. Slowly, I started walking down the aisles, calling out again and again, asking who was there and telling them they weren't supposed to be inside. No matter how hard I tried, my voice sounded shaky. I checked aisle after aisle, peered around corners, even looked behind stacks of boxes where no adult could realistically hide. Still, I found nothing. Eventually, I reached the back wall of the warehouse. Every row behind me was empty. I just stood there, staring out across the building, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. The only places left to check were a couple of narrow side corridors. If there really had been someone in the warehouse, those hallways were the only spots they could have slipped into. I figured I would have heard the heavy metal doors opening or closing, but there was no way I could just ignore it and go back to work without making sure. I pushed one of the doors open and looked inside. It led to an area I'd never really been in before, probably where the manager's offices and administrative rooms were. I had no reason to ever be back there. At first, I didn't see anyone. I turned around and let the door start to swing shut behind me. Just as it did, I heard another door open somewhere down the corridor. My stomach dropped. I spun around and caught the door before it closed, staring back down the hallway. This time, there was a man standing at the far end. He looked like he was in his early 20s, but there was something seriously off about him. His clothes were messy, his posture strange, and his eyes were wide. So wide I could see the whites of them even from that distance. I don't know if he was on drugs or something else, but the way he stared at me was disturbing on a deep, instinctual level. I called out, asking what he was doing there and telling him he needed to leave. He didn't react at all, no sign that he even understood what I'd said. I raised my voice and tried again, forcing myself to sound tougher. I told him I'd already called security, which wasn't true, but I was hoping it might scare him off. Instead, he started walking toward me. I couldn't tell if he was actually listening or just closing the distance. I stayed planted in the doorway, still talking, still trying to keep him from getting any closer. When he was about 15 or 20 feet away, I noticed something in his hand. By the time my eyes went back to his face, he lifted his arm and threw it. As hard as he could, the object flew straight at my head, missing me by inches and slamming into the doorframe beside me. The impact sent a sharp metallic crack echoing through the hallway, so loud it felt like it punched straight into my ears. It was either a hammer or a large metal wrench. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. I could hear him charging after me, sprinting like he was desperate to catch me. I glanced back a couple of times and saw him still right behind me, maybe 10 or 15 feet back with that same unhinged expression on his face. I reached the office, slammed the door, and locked it just in time. A second later, he crashed into the metal, trying to force it open. Thankfully, the office was solid. Just the reinforced door and a thick industrial window designed to take abuse in a warehouse environment. He moved to the window and started slamming his shoulder into it, punching it over and over. He looked completely out of control. Eventually, he must have realized he couldn't get in because he stopped, turned around, and slowly walked away toward the far end of the building, probably heading out a back exit. By then, I was already on the office phone calling the police. It took them a long time to arrive, though, and by that point, the guy could have been anywhere. This wasn't a modern facility, and the security cameras were terrible. The footage showed him breaking in through one of the doors and wandering the building, basically stalking me throughout my shift, but there were no clear shots of his face. There was no way to identify him or figure out why he broke in or tried to attack me. I stayed at that job for a while after that. Eventually, the whole thing started to feel unreal, like something I'd imagined because of how extreme it was. But in the end, I quit and took a similar job somewhere else. It just didn't feel worth sticking around, knowing there was a chance the guy could come back looking for me.